Good evening and welcome to the John Mather Visiting Scholar Lecture. My name is Fabrice Veron and I have the great pleasure of serving as the Interim Dean of the College of Earth, Ocean and Environment. And while I'm relatively new in this role, I've been a faculty member here at the University of Delaware and in the college for the last 20 years, and I can personally attest to the value of this annual tradition. I am also very excited to share with you that thanks to our ability to broadcast this lecture live online, we have this year, tonight, a record number of people participating and attending this lecture. Thank you to everyone who has joined us, whether here in person or on the live stream. The Mather Lecture is presented each year by the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences, thanks to the generous support of Dr. Sandy Mather, in memory of her husband, Russ Mather, who was a faculty member in the department for 40 years, spending 23 of these years as the department chair. Over his decades at the University of Delaware, Russ shaped the study of geography here and in the field more broadly. And for the past 13 years or so, Sandy has continued his legacy by promoting the exchange of the latest ideas in geography through this lecture. Sandy, would you please stand up so we can recognize and thank you for making this series possible. It is so nice to see you here, Sandy, in person, and to see everybody else here in the audience. As with so many things in the last year, the Mather Lecture was held virtually, and while we enjoyed a fascinating lecture on how cities affect rainfall, we missed on the opportunity to gather, to share ideas with one another, to celebrate this annual tradition. So for those of us and those of you joining us here in Clayton Hall tonight, I would like to invite you to stay after for a reception in the lobby after the lecture. But first, we're lucky tonight to hear from a leader in the field of resource governance who's worked in academia, nonprofit organization, and international affairs throughout his career. His background and lecture topic differ from last year's meteorology focus, but that only illustrates the incredible breadth of the discipline of geography. One of our strengths as a college, and certainly within the department, is an approach that use every relevant academic tool to understand and address environmental challenges, including the ways those environmental issues intersect with society. Tonight's topic, natural resource use and its relationship to both the COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing effort to mitigate climate change, is a subject that several faculty members at the University of Delaware also study, including Dr. Salim Ali, the chair of the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences. In fact, about 2/3 of the faculty in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Environment work on some aspect of climate change, as do scores of other faculty members throughout the University of Delaware. Because of this connection, the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences is co-hosting tonight's lecture with the university's newly formed Gerard Mangone Climate Change Science and Policy Hub. The hub brings together natural and social scientists, policy researchers, humanists, artists, teachers, designers, and anyone else at UD working on climate change. For any of you who have joined us from outside the department or the college, for whom this may be your first Mather Lecture, welcome and thank you for engaging in this work. And now I'd like to ask Dr. Salim Ali to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you in person after such a long time to this annual tradition in the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I'd like to acknowledge a few important co-sponsors and those who have made this event possible. The Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia has been a partner of ours in co-sponsoring events, and they have kindly also helped to publicize this event. We have Eli Gilman and Kayla Wendt from FPRI here, and you will see that there's a table outside with their journal Orbis, free copies available as well if you'd like to take one on your way out. In addition to FPRI, we have also had a very good relationship with the University of Pennsylvania and their Center of Excellence, an NSF Center of Excellence in critical metals. And they have also been very interested in the work that is being done around resource extraction and governance, and so they have also been very supportive of this event. And then individually, I would like to especially thank our wonderful staff, April English and Sandy Raymond, who I believe are still here, and you probably saw them greeting you at the entrance. They have worked quite tirelessly in organizing things, and we are very appreciative to them. Also special thanks to Mark Jolly, who's our communications director and is making arrangements and taking photographs as we speak. So, thanks to all of you and deep appreciation. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Anthony Bebbington and Dr. Denise Humphrey Bebbington. We're fortunate that Anthony Bebbington has also a life partner who is working in geography and is herself a distinguished academic, and we have the pleasure of both their company, and I hope you'll get to interact with both of them afterwards. Dr. Anthony Bebbington is currently the International Program Director for Natural Resources and Climate Change at the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation, I should mention anecdotally, has a connection to the University of Delaware. They were instrumental in establishing the School of Public Policy. A seed grant from the Ford Foundation established the Biden School of Public Policy, now called the Biden School of Public Policy. But in addition to his role with Ford Foundation, which is a relatively recent move, Dr. Bebbington has been a geographer at Clark University, where he was the head of School of Geography, and also Higgins Professor of Environment and Society at the university. In addition, he has held some of the most coveted titles in academia, including a member of the US National Academy of Sciences, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellow, and an Australian Laureate Fellow. As someone who also carries an Australian passport, I can tell you that the Australian Laureate Fellowship is the highest honor that Australian academia can give to any academic. In addition to that, he is also on the board of Oxfam America. He's been very dedicated to working with communities and civil society groups, and his role on the board of Oxfam, which, as you know, is one of the world's leading charities working on a range of issues, including helping refugees currently in many parts of the world, is a testament to him as being the epitome of an academic practitioner, someone who doesn't just sit in the ivory tower, but actually works directly where impact is possible. He did his doctorate at Clark University, which has had a wonderful geography department and is credited for, of course, launching many of the major GIS-related software. The Geographic Information Systems has some of its origins in Clark University. And his earlier degrees from Cambridge University in the UK in geography as well. So with that, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Bebbington to give the 2021 John R. Mather Lecture.
So the first challenge of the talk is taking my mask off without sending my glasses flying, which is okay. Let me get my timer out. This is not working. Never mind. So, first of all, my thanks. Thank you, Salim, for that very generous introduction. And thank you also to you and to the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences here for this very kind invitation to speak, and for the really fun and interesting conversations during the day and the difficult questions that students in particular have been asking during the day. It's a particular honor to give the Mather lecture for a variety of reasons, but not that I knew him, but I'm very aware of his singular role in building institutions in the discipline, not least this department, and its strengths in climatology. So that's a particular honor, so thank you. But I must say at the same time I feel a bit of an imposter, because I'm certainly not a climate scientist. My own work comes to climate indirectly through the ways in which natural resource control and governance intersect with climate change mitigation and adaptation, whether in the context of rural livelihoods in the Andes or the governance of mining in contexts of water scarcity and climate change. So that's one reason why I feel a bit of an imposter. The second reason I feel a bit of an imposter is that this talk won't be based really on my research so much as on experience. Well, the experience and the thinking and the worries of the NRCC program, the Natural Resources and Climate Change program that Salim was just mentioning at the Ford Foundation. So in that sense, it's a talk that's not building it's drawing on research, but it's trying to build an argument based on lessons from elements of practice. So given that context for the talk, let me first say something about the Natural Resources and Climate Change program, because it has a lot to do with the data that I'll refer to and the arguments that I hope to build. The primary focus of the NRCC program is on the strengthening and protection of community rights in contexts of resource extraction. And we understand strengthening rights as a pathway towards at least a couple of things. On the one hand, towards reduced inequalities and asymmetries of power in society, which is not quite the same as saying this is a rights-based approach to development, because we don't have any particular take on development. But it is to say that the starting point for the program is that, and for Ford as a whole, is that the depth of those intersecting inequalities in the contemporary world is just inherently bad, and it should be contested. And it should be contested so that groups who are disadvantaged by those asymmetric relationships are able to gain more power for self-determination and for self-realization. And another reason for this particular focus is related to climate change, because we see these natural resource rights in relationship to climate change. In particular, the program works from the view that strengthening community rights in land, territory, resources, and rights to free, prior, and informed consent is a route towards mitigating climate change. And we argue this on the grounds that community rights in forests, peatlands, and other resources will tend to lead to forms of land cover that emit less greenhouse gas emissions and store more carbon than is the case when that land is controlled by other interests and large-scale capital. And we argue, and I think with good reason, that there's a healthy analytical and scientific literature to support that claim, even when there are exceptions, and there are always exceptions. And so in that way, this is a program that argues that the way into the climate question should be, for us at least, through the door of community rights and social justice. Now, with that ex-ante focus on asymmetries of power, our entry point, analytically and contextually, is ideally to ask how institutions and dominant political coalitions might change so as to create the political space for equity-enhancing solutions to emerge and to go to scale. And we take that entry point because we also believe that one can argue for the technical and equity-enhancing superiority of certain solutions until we're blue in the face. But those arguments will not fare well if the political settlements and dominant pacts are not conducive to change. Now, that technical solutions cannot be discussed separately from political power is just for geographers in the room, political ecology 101. But it's worth reminding ourselves of this in the context of debates on the urgency of climate change and of mitigating climate change and of adapting to climate change, because that narrative of urgency can so easily lead to an emphasis on technologies as solutions, just technologies as solutions, whether these are physical technologies, market technologies, or other technologies. So with that emphasis on community rights, political space, we as a program make grants around the world, but primarily in Mexico, Central America, the Andean region, Brazil, Indonesia, West Africa, and Southern Africa, as well as to organizations based in the European Union and the US who are working on natural resource governance with this sort of rights focus. So that's a spread of organizations that we support, and we can talk more about this in Q&A or outside afterwards if it would be of interest. But we support organizations of indigenous, Afro-descendant, and peoples and local communities in general. We support national and international NGOs. We support think tanks and research centers, journalists, media consultants, and media outlets, and also at times pockets of innovation within government. That's less frequent, but we certainly do that from time. And those relationships with grantees tend to be long-term, and as such, they become critical to how we, as a program and as a foundation, learn. So that also means that the remainder of what I'll say relies heavily on these networks of partners, as well as on colleagues at Ford and elsewhere. So that's sort of the origin of material I'll draw upon in the rest of the talk. And with that long introduction, I'd like to organize the remainder of what I'll say in 3 parts. The first part, or the first block, is an attempt to take stock of some of COVID-19's, or the pandemic's, direct and indirect impacts to date on natural resource governance. Excuse me. And to some degree on climate activism. And I want to point to 4 domains of impact. The second block looks forward and reflects on ways in which COVID-19 might influence the relationships among natural resources, social justice, and climate change mitigation downstream of the pandemic. And I'll focus on 3 domains there. And then the final section is just a way of trying to wrap up and draw out a couple of what I hope are implications of the argument. So, first of all, a reflection on some aspects of the indirect and direct impacts of COVID to date on natural resource governance, seen through our lens and the lens that we have the privilege to share with our partners. So as the pandemic began to take hold in the second quarter of 2020, we began, as Ford, to hear from partners about the impacts that COVID was having. Some of the most heart-wrenching accounts were of activists and leaders who had died. This impact was particularly grave in that first year among indigenous communities in the Amazonian region. The Pan-Amazonian Ecclesiastic Network, working across the whole of the Pan-Amazon, reported close to 38,000 indigenous people dying in the Pan-Amazon during 2020. Those included, for instance, Robinson Lopez of Colombia, who was also the climate change coordinator for COICA, which is the coordinating body of indigenous organizations of the Amazon basin. It included Aitana Yawalapiti, a leader from the Alto Xingu in Brazil, who the New York Times called, in one of their COVID obituaries, quote, a living bulwark against the destruction of indigenous culture in Brazil, who worked to defend his people's land in the Amazon against prospectors, loggers, and ranchers. And those who died also included Santiago Manguin, a longtime leader of the Consejo Aguaruna Wambisa in Peru, and a very close friend of a close colleague and friend of Denise's and mine, Javier Arellano Yanguas. And Santiago Manguin, among other things, had played a really important role in stopping a really nasty confrontation between the authorities and in local communities in 2009, in which 33 people did die, but many, many more people could have died. And he played a critical role in stopping that from getting out of hand. In those numbers, Peru suffered particularly. And deaths like Santiago Manguin's pointed to the utter failure of the Peruvian healthcare system during COVID and the acutely unequal access to healthcare and oxygen for rural and especially indigenous communities. That failure, and here there's a link to resource extraction debates, that failure gave the lie to any argument that Peru's mining and hydrocarbon-led resource boom in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s had built strong institutions or social inclusion. Instead, Peru's health system proved itself to be weak and exclusionary, even after 20 years of mining-led growth. Such deaths were individual tragedies, but they also had impacts on natural resource governance. Rule change in how natural resources are governed are won and then defended in large part by individuals, not acting solely, but individuals and leaders and negotiators are critical in that process. Leaders and negotiators with innate and accumulated skills to create spaces for change. So losing these people means losing those capacities. So my first block is that those individual tragedies. But alongside those individual losses, our partners were also reporting a series of organizational impacts of COVID. These impacts were not brand new, but they did reflect how COVID had intensified challenges that existed prior to the pandemic. And just as some examples, partners would tell us of problems of financial resilience and instability caused by an overall reduction of funds that they had available to them, but also the fact that they had to use their regular funds just to respond to community emergencies and staff emergencies on their teams. Partners reported, and this is important, sometimes I think gets forgotten in discussions of civil society and of non-governmental organizations and social movements, but they reported the severe pressures on staff mental health and welfare, which included work stresses, fears about safety, and so on, and a reminder of just how difficult that sort of work can be. Partners were struggling with connectivity. With restrictions on travel and meetings, virtual communications were key, but this raised real problems for smaller organizations located outside the principal cities. So their challenge was how to do advocacy, how to coordinate new modes of protest, how to sustain movements, and how to share information when connectivity was constrained or in some cases just absent. And that came bundled with a fourth set of concerns around digital security, for obvious reasons. So that combination of organizational stress and loss of leaders has, among other things, I want to argue, we would argue, made it easier for political and economic elites to exert their interests and their visions of society and of environmental governance, with implications for climate change, which I'll come to as well. Those individual and organizational impacts, and this is my third domain, have been aggravated by the ongoing reduction of civic space, restriction of civic space, which itself is arguably another global pandemic whose contagion has been accelerated by COVID, or at least under COVID, under the conditions of COVID. So just as a measure of this, looking across the world, the NGO Civicus, the leading NGO in thinking about civic space, reported that during 2020, only 42 countries, making up just 3.4% of global population, had safeguarded civic space. Everywhere else, the trend was adverse. That reduction of civic space has played out in diverse ways. And I'll note just a few. And apologies if this list feels like it might go on a little bit too long, but I think it's important to think about this as part of our way of thinking about climate change possibilities. So in one domain, or one subdomain here, it's constrained civil society organization ability to do advocacy around climate change mitigation and environmental justice, and to engage with related policy processes. So for instance, COVID public health restrictions, and we know this from here too, have been used to prevent or criminalize protests, gatherings, and marches, and some political and economic leaders have explicitly tried to use such restrictions to press forward on regulatory reforms to facilitate the further rollout of resource extraction, infrastructure, and agro-industry. One of the most palpable cases was the case of Brazil and the Minister of Environment, Ricardo Salles, making that argument explicitly. Now, here's a time when we can move quickly on this because attention is diverted elsewhere to COVID. Those same public health restrictions have been used to limit consultation processes. When the government of Indonesia passed its so-called omnibus bill in 2020, a law for promoting job creation that also included the weakening of environmental and social safeguards governing natural resource investments, there was scarcely any consultation on the draft bill on the grounds that COVID made consultation too risky and too dangerous. A third area that I won't talk about in depth is simply the criminalization of criticism. Drawing attention to similar restrictions on civic space in the United Kingdom, this is a UK example, my patria, my homeland, or my other one. In July of this year, 2021, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, David Boyd, expressed concern about 3 pieces of planned legislation in the UK. The policing bill, which proposes changes to enforcement and sentencing, the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Bill, which protects undercover state agents from prosecution of crimes, for crimes, and plans to weaken judicial review, the process through which ministerial decisions are challenged, including decisions on the environment. Boyd is reported as saying that, quote, "These 3 pieces of legislation are shrinking civic space at a time when the global environmental crisis demands that people's voices are heard." And The Guardian, the newspaper The Guardian reporting on this, talked of these as, quote, 3 pieces of legislation that will make human rights violations more likely to occur and less likely to be sanctioned, even as averting climate catastrophe depends on those rights. The UK. Secondly, there's those sorts of restrictions. Secondly, have been deliberate efforts to restrict public debate and information. You could think about a raft of examples here. In the natural resources space, companies have been using strategic litigation against public participation, against our grantees, among others. And in some cases, this is encouraged by the easing of the regulatory environment. The Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, who's also one of our grantees, identified 355 cases that bear the hallmarks of SLAPS, that's the acronym for this legal instrument, or legal practice, that were brought or initiated by business actors since 2015. And 65% of those had to do with natural resource extraction. And the largest category was actually the mining sector. So what SLAPS tried to do is to deliberately divert attention and resources of activists and civil society organizations from the work they do because they have to defend themselves against these suits for defamation. And the effect of SLAPS can be more broadly chilling. Presumably, fearing litigation like SLAPS, some virtual platforms have removed or blocked distribution of controversial news. One platform has, for instance, blocked or deleted hundreds of posts by one of our grantees, a media organization, whose reporting focuses on environmental, climate, and social impacts, particularly related to resource extraction, though not only. And environmental journalism, and I know that's also a theme, I don't know if it's a minor or a major here, but environmental journalism has also suffered as part of broader pressures on journalism. Just as a couple of examples, both from Brazil. The National Federation of Journalists in Brazil reported 428 cases of violence, including 2 murders, against journalists in 2020, the most violent year over a 30-year period. And a report by the Brazilian Association for Investigative Journalism, ABRAJI, reported that Brazilian politicians filed 399 lawsuits to remove content published by media outlets. There's also been closure of organizations, limitations on their permissible activities, and just increased public criticism of their work. Earlier this year, Nicaragua, in August of this year, Nicaragua withdrew permits for 45 NGOs and asked 6 of them to leave, including Oxfam. And that response reflected, and this is related again, it is related to climate activism. It's broadly about the non-governmental sector, but it is the latest phase in a period of significant repression, among other things, of student movements, whose initial mobilizations had a lot to do with student responses to uncontrolled fires in the Bossoas Reserve. So in some sense, these are also restrictions that constrain activities to try and draw attention to and do work on the forces driving greenhouse gas emissions and driving climate change. And that's a model, the Nicaragua model is a model that the playbook travels. El Salvador is clearly picking up elements of that playbook now. And meanwhile, the killings of environmental defenders continue, made easier by the absence of government officials or policing because of COVID. Frontline defenders recorded 331 killings of social justice activists in 2020, over 220 of whom were activists working on natural resources. Global Witness, also a grantee of ours, as our frontline defenders, published this year in September numbers on the killing of environmental defenders that showed the rates of killings had not let up, and this year was a particularly bad year, but the average has been a running average of about 4 murders a week for several years now. Drilling down at a country level, the NGO Indepaz in Colombia calculates that some 681 indigenous rights and lands defenders have been killed there since 2016. And at a much more specific level, 4 members of Ofrané, which is the Black people's organization of Honduras, were removed from their homes in July 2020, along with one other person, and have still not been found. Now, several of these trends clearly precede COVID, and I do not want to suggest in any way that COVID created them. However, in many cases, they do appear to have interacted with COVID to further constrain civil society ability to monitor and hold accountable natural resource governance and the forces that drive climate change through, among other things, forest loss and hydrocarbon burning. And the fourth domain of impacts, I'm just looking at my time here, the partners mentioned was the increasing pressure on natural resources and the natural resource rights of communities. That's, say, direct pressure. These others were pressures on lives, organizations, civic space. This is direct pressure on resources. Perhaps the most dramatic example, once again, being Brazil, where the government of Jair Bolsonaro has encouraged forest clearance and the invasion of indigenous lands, with the result that the area deforested between August 2020 and July 2021 was the highest in a decade. At the same time, violence against communities has increased, with widely reported killings in Yanomami and Munduruku communities earlier this year that were in the press here. And to the extent that reduction of deforestation is essential, and it clearly is essential for any 1.5 degree aspiration, then this impact on forests of these investments and those who defend them is acutely detrimental to mitigating climate change. And these changes also constrain the possibility for climate activism more generally, referring back to the UK examples as well. So those are my 4 blocks of, one could talk about many more impacts. I'm sure scholars and students here in the university do other sort of work around these sorts of effects. But those are ones that we hear from, we've heard from a lot from our partners, and that particularly worry us. So looking forward, moving to my next section, my penultimate section, what might be some of the challenges in the coming years that are in one or another way related to COVID? As I said, I want to comment on 3 challenges in 3 domains, 2 in particular, that are related to economic reactivation, civic space again, and energy transition. So as they try to reactivate economies after the destructions of lives and value wrought by COVID, there is a very real risk that governments will facilitate and encourage yet further destruction of nature. And this risk is accentuated by a certain politics of urgency in which the need to restore growth, rebuild public finances, generate jobs, all worthy aspirations, and so on, will both encourage and provide political cover for making policy decisions that prioritize growth over justice and over nature. I've already mentioned the Omnibus Bill in Indonesia, which scaled back environmental and social safeguards on investments. There's another reactivation initiative at the project level in Indonesia, just as one example. The government is planning a 900,000 hectare rice development scheme in central Kalimantan in response to and the argument is it's in response to food security impacts of COVID, which is a understandable, arguably legitimate argument. But that program will be rolled out on peatlands and will be entirely implemented by large-scale investment. So the implications for emissions are significant. In Brazil, back to Brazil again, the government's been seeking to remove protections on indigenous lands so that resource extraction can occur on those lands, and that's happening both through the courts as well as through Congress. One proposed bill will allow mineral exploration on indigenous lands as well as use of their water to produce energy. So the presumption is what the idea here is search for resources, install mines, but also have the right to be able to use the water for hydroelectricity to provide the energy that those operations need. Again, that's a bill that facilitates processes that are already underway. For those GIS and remote sensing colleagues here in the room who may know the MAP Biomas project in Brazil, which is a wonderful initiative, that's already identified a 495% increase in mining in indigenous lands over the last 10 years. And that's not only small-scale mining. So these trends are occurring more broadly. A review released earlier this year by the Forest Peoples Program looked at the social and environmental safeguards as part of reactivation policies in Brazil, Colombia, DRC, Indonesia, and Peru. And among their various conclusions, one was that states are prioritizing the expansion, this is quoting, of the energy sector, infrastructure, mining and logging, and the development of industrial agriculture in or near indigenous territories, while failing, and you can guess, while failing to protect the land and self-determination rights of indigenous peoples, including their rights to free, prior, and informed consent to projects that affect their lands and their lives. There's also an intersection between reactivation and fossil fuels. The 2020 Production Gap Report which is produced by Stockholm Environment Institute, ODI, which is where I used to work back in the day, IISD, E3G, and UNEP, who Salim collaborates with and works with, notes that governments committed more COVID-19 recovery funds to fossil fuels than to clean energy, with $233 billion for activities supporting fossil fuels, mostly by encouraging consumption, and $146 billion for renewable energy and low-carbon alternatives. As my counterpart at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Michael Northrup, has noted passionately, this simply reproduces a broader pattern in which private finance and equity continue to flow towards fossil fuels. The Rainforest Action Network report, Banking on Climate Chaos, concluded that the world's 60 largest commercial banks financed $3.8 trillion of investment in fossil fuel development, have done that since the 2015 Paris Accords. And a parallel report noted that private equity had financed a further $1.1 trillion since 2010. And so, as Michael says, regardless of the statements by the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero at COP just now, it's still striking that unlike any of the other sectors, this is quoting Michael, implicated in speeding global warming, there is still not a single one of the 60 major commercial banks that has staked out a leadership position on decarbonizing. So reactivation is needed. That means what the infrastructure bill is all about. But it will come in many regions of the world with, at best, ambiguous implications for climate change and also potentially for civic space, which is what I want to talk about now, but much more briefly, given what I've already said. So I don't want to dwell much on the civic space issue, but I think it's at least reasonable to fear that the post-COVID context will continue to aggravate pressures on civic space, the space to organize, the space to do advocacy, the space to do litigation even. In some sense, civic space may get placed in the same category as environmental safeguards, being viewed as an obstacle to investment that needs to be rolled back in pursuit of economic reactivation, which may be a cataclysmic read, but I just put it out there as a risk. And in this sense, the post-COVID period is one that intersects with another process that's also been intensifying in recent years, namely the rise of authoritarian capitalisms, or what Anne Applebaum, a staff writer at The Atlantic and also faculty or adjunct faculty at Johns Hopkins, calls Autocracy Inc. By Autocracy Inc., she's referring to intersecting networks of autocrats and their supporters and enablers, whose, in her arguments, whose interest is wealth, private wealth gain and wealth accumulation, and who support each other through networks of mutual buying and selling and cover. And that's relevant for our discussion because natural resources play an important role in those networks of wealth extraction and wealth transfer, among other reasons, because the natural resource rents are sitting there waiting to be captured. And so in that sense, Autocracy Inc., which by implication or by definition is not good for civic space, is also really bad news for climate change and for the factors driving greenhouse gas emissions. That's all I want to say about civic space looking forward, but this is another theme that worries us, and particularly our sister program on civic engagement and government at Ford Foundation, who we collaborate with on some of these issues. And third, the energy transition, which will inevitably and necessarily be part of the post-COVID world, but will also raise challenges for social justice that we ignore at our peril. Some of these challenges relate to what will happen to the populations and regional economies. Sorry, I'm aware that I'm running over. I'll try and probably fail to speed up. What will happen to populations and regional economies depend upon hydrocarbons extraction. So notwithstanding all the environmental, and I just mentioned these cases because these are cases that are close to our hearts in our program, all the environmental and social costs of coal mining in Kalimantan, Indonesia, Mpumalanga in South Africa, or La Guajira and El Cesar in Colombia, it remains the case that many livelihoods will be lost as coal mining is wound down. The situation with oil, if not as extreme, is not dissimilar. There are people in communities who've benefited from providing services to oil operations or enjoying services paid for by oil taxes. So one of the political challenges, as we know in our own context here, will be how to avoid, in contexts like those, the emergence of movements who are angry about the undoing of regional economies and opposed to an energy transition in which they have been the losers. A second sense in which the energy transition and issues that surround it may be significant looking forward for both social justice and climate change has to do with those territories and communities that are going to be affected by new investments that are driven by the energy transition. Just as a couple of very different examples at different scales. So my colleague, or our colleague at Clark University, John Rogan, has begun to document, this is microscale, but begun to document very systematically the microscale, steady, progressive loss of forest in Massachusetts because of the installation of solar panels in the state. On a larger scale, not massive, but on a larger scale, in Mexico, wind farms that have been installed on community lands have compromised prior landscapes and indigenous forms or local community forms of land governance, which has been particularly well documented and particularly complicated in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Oaxaca, but also elsewhere. And the energy transition will have implications for, or this intersection between COVID, reactivation, transition, for this social justice, inequality, climate relationship looking forward. Because, as many of you doubtless know, because of work already going on here, the energy transition will be mineral intensive. If the installation of solar and wind is space extensive, the technology part of that transition is mineral intensive, and both have implications, I want to suggest, or could have implications, for social justice and social conflict around these investments. All the more so because the IEA has recently projected that the power sector global power sector by 2050 will have to supply 4 times more energy than it supplies right now, which is massive amounts of electricity and presumably implies massive amounts of, among other things, investments in photovoltaics and wind energy. And estimates are, and people in this room will know other numbers and better numbers, but some estimates are that photovoltaic power requires 40 times more copper than fossil fuel combustion, and wind power, for example, up to 14 times, not 40, sorry, times more iron. Indeed, colleagues at the University of Queensland, where these are colleagues of Salim, still colleagues of Salim's, estimate that the energy transition will mean that the first half of this century will see the production of 9 times more copper mine tailings than was produced during the whole of the 20th century, which makes for a very large footprint. The expanded extraction of lithium in the southern Andes of Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, for instance, that's required for lithium-ion batteries, will lead to irreversible destruction of the salt flats in whose brine the lithium resides, and salt flats that are ecologically and culturally significant for nearby communities. And also, as scholars here in the room know better than I, some 70% of global cobalt is currently sourced from the forests of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And its expanded extraction will clearly have implications for forest quality and forest governance and presumably forest loss, as well as human impacts. And again, there are different projections by different actors. One World Bank study projects that cobalt production has to increase 5-fold by 2050 to meet the demands for cobalt use in EV batteries and wind turbines. And all these, not all, many of these minerals are located underneath or on, in the case of the salt flats, somebody's land. And so the expanded extraction of critical minerals for the energy transition will raise real issues for free, prior, and informed consent, land and territorial rights, how to organize the sharing and the benefits that are generated by these forms of extraction, and of course for land use and spatial planning. So the social justice challenges of an energy transition are real, and they need to be addressed head on. In a recent paper, ActionAid, another grantee, laid out 4 principles for just transition. They argued that just transitions should address, address and not exacerbate inequalities, transform systems to work for people, nature, and climate, ensure inclusiveness and participation, and develop comprehensive plans and policy frameworks. All of this seems both general, and of course it's way more easier said than done, but it seems important to keep these principles in mind and at the front of debate in order to hold investors, companies, governments, energy policymakers to account when they make arguments about the, quote, urgent necessity of transition and the urgent need to extract minerals that transition urgently needs. Also, among other things, to help remember that just because something's urgent, it may not happen quickly. If those investments encounter the sorts of resistance and social conflict that have characterized a decent number of other mineral investments in preceding decades, then the investments will not necessarily move forward quickly, and therefore the transition will be mineral compromised. So to wrap up, this is not really a wrap-up. It says final word here, because it's not a conclusion, it's not a wrap-up, but it's a final word. In an essay published in September this year, under the title, "Has COVID Ended the Neoliberal Era?" historian Adam Tooze of Columbia University argued that the pandemic has put the world at a turning point. He doesn't say whether that turning point is necessarily one for the better, but he does insist that what is critical, of course this doesn't make it right, I'm just putting this out here as an argument, but he does insist that what's critical about the moment is that the turning point, or the possibility of the turning point, is upon us. For him, COVID and responses to COVID have placed on the table questions about, for instance, the absolute need for, but the chronic difficulty of achieving global collective action, the newfound legitimacy of large-scale coordinated public spending, the recognition of just how fragile human and social life is, just one interspecies jump away from crisis. It's put on the table questions about the precarity of established democracies, go back to the civicus figures, the vulnerabilities that flow from global connection, and also the depths of inequalities in our societies and the risk that those inequalities pose for our collectivity, even if COVID has also shown that some are quite happy to deepen those inequalities further, as they have deepened under COVID. They're not comforting thoughts, but yet I want to ask or wonder whether by making clear the relationships between inequalities and the vulnerability of everything and everyone, and by exposing in a deeply visceral way the dependence of society upon nature, and by revealing just how hard it has been for society and countries to act collectively in the face of immediate threat, COVID has created space for the sort of thinking about system change that's essential for any significant response to climate change. And in that sense, the hope, and it's a hope, must be that the last 2 years have helped to undermine the legitimacy of what is and to create space for narratives about what might be. How far those narratives can be seized and used to open up political space depends upon the ability of innovators, wherever they are, to craft narratives that have the capacity to convince and to mobilize, at the same time as having the capacities to navigate asymmetries of power and closing civic space as they build those narratives. And it seems to me that, or I want to suggest, and this is the final word, thanks for your forbearance, that if that's at least partly an argument, then supporting narrative work becomes key. And here, I think there is a really special role for universities, or the academy, in crafting narratives which are based in multiple knowledges, that run the range from the humanities to science, but narratives about other ways of living and other ways of organizing. We know historically the power of narratives in fostering social change. We know that from Marx, and we know that from the rise of neoliberalism as a way of organizing society. So we know that narratives can articulate and foster profound systemic social change, but they have to be developed. They're not going to just happen out of nowhere. They're not only going to be developed by universities, but I think universities have a special role in helping cultivate those narratives and also cultivating environments for the emergence of the new narrators who will emerge from the student bodies in these universities. So not a classic climate talk, but thank you very much for your forbearance. These are the things that worry us in our program. And I'd be very happy to entertain any questions here or outside. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bebbington, for the erudition of your presentation covering such a contemporary topic with scholarly insight, but also very concrete examples and current investigative data. So there are two ways to ask questions. You have received index cards. You can write a question, and then I can take those questions and try to make the process efficient. Or if you feel energized to say a few words on the floor, we do have mics as well. So any takers who have written questions or like to ask on the floor? Would you like? Yes. And please introduce yourself also.
Hi, I'm Nancy Boyer in the Department of Geography, and I have a question about social justice and narratives, and if whether the Ford Foundation has a narrative or from your context in your work, whether or not you see a vision of social justice and equity emerging, like, and you could give a specific example if you like.
So I would, over the last decade to 15 years, the centrality of social justice has become more and more apparent in Ford's work. And over the last 8 to 10 years, but particularly the last 8 years, under Darren Walker's leadership, that's been very much grounded in a notion of racial justice. And the narrative, if it is, as tends to typify how Darren will frame narratives, it's not that what the president says everybody else believes and does, but just as an example. It combines critique and hope. And the hope, or I guess the mission part of the narrative is the argument that the absence of social justice, the relative absence of social justice, does harm to us all, embodied in multiple forms of inequality and how they intersect with each other. And it does harm to us all by compromising our sense of self, by compromising our sense of societal coherence. On the economy side, there's plenty of analysis to suggest that it can compromise the quality of growth. So it's an argument that forward-looking says one should hope for social justice and aspire to social justice, not just because it's right in and of itself, but it has, this is not the language that colleagues at Ford would necessarily use, or would use, but it has multiple positive spillover effects. On the analytical side, on the causal and critique side, the argument, I'm not sure if it's a narrative, but the argument would, now here I'm speaking for, throughout I've been speaking for Tony Bebbington, who happens to work at Ford. I'm not speaking for Ford. But the narrative would be that the injustices are deeply historical, and that as a consequence, they're very sticky to change and resistant to change. But that with a combination of, and this again kind of speaks to this, the mixing of programs at Ford, I guess, with a combination of cultural work, Ford has a very significant creative and free expression program, of political and legal work, it has this very significant civic engagement and government program domestically and internationally, and specifically work around gender, race, and ethnicity. Primarily, that works primarily around questions of empowerment. Then those sticky historical institutions of injustice can be changed and will be changed. And that we should all be invested in that. because ultimately the spillover effects are positive. So whether that's a narrative or not, but that's how I think of the way, because it also feeds into how the foundation would talk about philanthropy, the need for philanthropy to move from a charity frame to a justice frame. But that's a whole other discussion. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but that's sort of some of the key themes that cut across the way that social justice gets talked about at Ford. But it's very closely tied at Ford to questions of racial justice.
Thank you, Tony. Here's another question.
Micah Peterson. I did my grad work here in 2017, and I'm a captain in the Army now. My question is regarding the energy transition that you mentioned earlier, and specifically the documentation on a micro level with the solar panels in Massachusetts and then wind farms. What's the narrative that you, or I guess the argument that you hope to drive as you expand on that into the future? Is it more focused on how do you expand those respective technologies in a just manner, or is it an alternative to those alternatives that you hope to promote?
That's the $64,000 or million or billion-dollar question to us. We as a program, this is a self-critique, a mea culpa. The narrative on forests and rights and climate change mitigation is clear, to me at least. I think it's clearly articulated, substantiated, and grounded in plenty of scientific and analytical work. The narrative on energy transition isn't yet. It's this I was in a colleagues who Salim knows. I was in a call with colleagues who Salim knows who've worked on, actually 2 separate calls with one group based in North America, another group based in Europe, who've been working on these themes for a long time. But in both calls, which were independent of each other, they also drew attention to this sense that the mineral and the scalar implications of the energy transition had caught them by surprise. They hadn't been thinking about that. The argument had been there has to be an energy transition. There has to be less hydrocarbon burning. It had not been, and what does that transition come bundled with in terms of supply chains, governance arrangements, and so forth? And so those were also conversations about the urgent need to develop a narrative. And it cannot be a narrative of no, clearly, because the transition has to happen. It presumably will have to be a narrative grounded in some of those issues I was pointing to about respect for free, prior, and informed consent. That probably comes bundled with much more progressive and generous approaches to benefit sharing with communities to share in the benefits that flow from the extraction of those resources, whether that's co-ownership or shareholder involvement, but something there. It will have to come, another part of it will presumably have to be caught up with notions of spatial planning and some no-go areas. So it cannot be a narrative of no, but it almost certainly should be a narrative, as in the case of hydrocarbons, and that there are certain areas that this just should not happen, this form of extraction or this form of installation of new sources of energy should go ahead on grounds that are whatever those grounds are. And again, sorry to call out Salim, but that's a discussion that he's very much involved in, and I think some of you in the room, around seabed mining, deep sea mining. Because that's at its core, that's an argument about no-go or not no-go areas and what should be the criteria for defining no-go areas, and people disagree. So your question is spot on, and there isn't one. I think those would be some of the underlying principles, but those are not, it's not a narrative. Those are just things to take into consideration. And then the narratives have to be grounded, I think. And again, this is one where the forest's narrative is so much stronger. They have to be grounded in actual experiences of policy processes that work. And that systematic documentation about energy transition that works in the general sense, in a justice sense, in an energy provision sense, in a just energy access sense, that work clearly remains to be done. My intuition is that one of the real labs for that work will be South Africa, where it has to work. And if it can be made to work in South Africa, and I mention that because of the commitments made at COP for the 8.5 billion to help South Africa move out of coal. If that's possible, if it can work, then that will be a very powerful input into developing the grounded narratives.
Great, thank you. So we've got basically we'll do two questions together, and then Tony, you can wrap up with, they may not be related questions. I've got one online question that's coming from Robert de Damalura, who was a Ph.D. graduate of our program, and he's now actually working for the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. So he's in a similar role, working for a major foundation. And he asked, he would like your thoughts around how the current movements in social and climate justice are being dismissed as wokeism and cancel culture, and whether this is increasingly part of a postmodern movement seeking to overthrow the current global social order structured around centralized authority. So that's one. And the next one is on there, yes.
Hi, yes. I'm Martin Clifford. I'm also in the geography department here. I wondered what you thought of the previous and ongoing role of international financed institutions, which have often been sort of central in establishing natural resource portfolios in middle and lower income countries and relatively criticized for it. What role do they have in mediating this relationship between the grassroots, in inverted commas, and larger extractive industries? Thanks.
I mean, I suppose there is a theme that connects to a question around centralization. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to successfully connect an answer, though, or a response. So I was mentioning to some people this morning that as it happens, something just appeared in my mailbox last night, I guess. A report on ways of enhancing security for youth movement activists around climate because of the risks that they increasingly confront, whether those are physical risks or judicial risks or risks just in the sphere of belittling and the like, which is just, I think, an important reminder that those leaders of those youth movements are really brave, really smart. I was at the dinner at COP, and the young person who convenes First Friday in Germany was there, and was so impressive, so smart, but very brave as well. So what do I think about youth? I mean, I think those movements have moved a needle, and that's immensely important. And they've moved a needle not around questions of wokeness or whatever, and far be it from me to even really understand and second guess. but they've moved a needle that points right at us, at our generation in particular, which manifests itself in different ways. And one of the ways in which this manifests itself on Clark's campus that Denise can talk about much more than I, because she's involved in this initiative called the New Earth Conversation, which brings together faculty, students, one senses that one of the frustrations of students is in that initiative is, you old farts, you're constantly talking about loss. We've just grown up with this. We want to know, we want to act, and we want to think about futures. We don't want to mourn what's gone. And don't tell us, you have no right to tell us what's gone because it's your generation that did this. And I think that's one of the really important ways in which the youth movements on climate have shifted the tone of the debate and the element of debate, because in some way, I'm thinking on the fly here, Salim, sorry, but in some way they've called out shame and how ashamed our generation should be. And that strikes me as really, really important. They're not movements that, as movements, movements generally don't come up with specific policy processes. They create the space for discussions about what specifically can be done, and that's the critical role of movements. And I think those youth movements have absolutely done that, and that's why questions of protection are raising their head, because there are certain interests that don't want that. Whether they're then on international, the centralization one, sorry, I'm going to skip over, although I think there's, in those new narratives and in thinking forward, the issue of centralization, decentralization is going to be very present in thinking about energy systems and energy provision, forms of self-governance and so forth. Certainly, if you take your Ostrom seriously, then decentralization should absolutely be part of those discussions. And, I have to answer your question. I've worked at the World Bank a couple of times. And so you have to take this answer with that, through that lens. I do believe that the international financial institutions are players. And different institutions and different players can have different conversations, and they can't all have the same conversation, and the need is to link those conversations. And as ages ago, probably nobody in the room maybe read this literature, a political scientist who since passed away, brilliant woman, Judith Tendler, argued about rural development, that you have to engage elites in processes of change. She was primarily working in Brazil. And that's the case, I think, for all these sorts of issues that we worry about. The solution to these, this is very much personal. This is not, movements are not the solution to every issue, and not the solution for every conversation. And in those processes of change, sectors of elites have to change and change their thinking. And for those sorts of conversations, I do think that the IFIs continue to have an important role to play. Whether they'll play that role is a different story. But from my time inside the bank, I do believe that there are certainly groups inside those institutions that want to play that sort of role of not just lending and investing, but of elite persuasion.
Well, thank you so much, Tony, for taking on those questions. We're finding the bridge. So unfortunately, we have to end the Q&A period here, but we have closing remarks. But let's just take a moment to thank Tony for taking the time to so thoughtfully expressing these questions. Wonderful. So now, for our closing remarks, I'm going to invite Professor Dana Verone and Professor Jules Bruck, who are the co-directors of the Mangon Climate Science and Policy Hub, to say a few words of connecting our discussions today with the launch of the hub and then you are invited to refreshments and reception.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to thank our speaker for that very interesting talk, and I'd actually like to push back a little bit about thinking that this was not really a climate talk. One of our faculty members here at the University of Delaware has said that, climate change is a problem because it is a human problem. And so I think you very clearly demonstrated in many distinct examples of why this is true. And in fact, one of my professional societies, the American Geophysical Union, their monthly magazine came to my office today, and it says on the front of it, "Science is society." So I think that connection is actually very clear. I'm very pleased that the Climate Change Science and Policy Hub could co-host this event, and I'm very grateful that Sandy Mather has actually facilitated this. We've had such a lovely, august group of speakers who have presented to this community over the years. The new Climate Change Hub is a research center here on campus that's really designed to facilitate a lot of this work that we were talking about today. We are looking to be a place where we can really elevate the wonderful work that's happening around climate change challenges that are happening in our world, and share that across our community, bring our community together so we can facilitate and I think create this space that Dr. Bebbington was talking about, where we can bring new narratives to light and really develop solutions that are not just solutions to an ecosystem challenge or a infrastructure challenge, but really look towards solutions that will be equity enhancing. And so we will be available in the lobby to talk with you about this new endeavor, but I know that I'm standing between you and a lovely reception, and so that I would just like to thank our speaker and our host once again, and thank you for all attending tonight.